and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? These are the standard questions I ask on this podcast. I am your host, Richard Littauer. Before I introduce our guest, I want to say it's nice to be back. I haven't recorded the podcast in a while. We had some back in December with the Python Software Foundation. I hope you continue to donate to their cause. They are the best. And of course, we had some back in June, and Errol has recently recorded a ton at DevCon for Ethereum. Thank you, Errol. Those are very fun podcasts. But I'm joined today in a studio, which is really weird, but kind of cool. In a studio in Edinburgh, in my old uni in the basement where I recorded and failed my phonetics class like 15 years ago because I'm now old. By Miranda Heath. Miranda is sitting opposite. Miranda, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Excited to be here.
We're excited to have you here, and thank you for hosting me, because technically you're a PhD student, and that's how we have access to this room.
You're welcome.
It's very nice. I first met Miranda at FOSDEM, which of course is the largest open source conference in the world. It happens in Brussels every year in February. I cannot begin to tell you how kind of annoying it is to go to Belgium in February, but it's fine. Some of us survived. And I met you there, but we had previously discussed talking about something that you've been doing for the past 6 months or a year. You've built this amazing report about maintainer burnout.
That's right.
So you're a PhD student, and you're in the psychology department, and you work in the psychology of understanding how people deal with altruism or how people deal with contributing to things. You know, you're probably a better elevator pitch at your own work than I am. Can you explain to me what you study?
Am I a better elevator pitch explainer of it? So I'm interested in altruism and what motivates people to do something for the benefit of others. And I started studying this from the perspective of psychology. And then I realized through the course of this that there's a lot of exploitation of people who engage in altruistic behavior. And we also have this picture of altruistic behavior as something like something that an individual does. So an individual giving away their own resources to other people, distant strangers usually. Like the prototypical example is an individual giving their money to charity to help someone far away. But there are these other forms of altruism that maybe don't think of when we use the word altruism that I think get neglected. So things like working together to give away collective resources or to build something that's beneficial as a group often doesn't fall under the definition of altruism as measured in psychology. And doing care for people close to you, care work, maintenance work often gets neglected as well. So it kind of felt natural from this type of research, looking at the collective components of altruism, that I would get interested in open source, because in open source, it's a community of people who recognize that what we build together can be better than something that we build on our own. And the value of the thing that we make doesn't belong to any one of us. It's not one person giving money to charity and being hailed as an altruist, but it's something that we've all built together. So my interests align naturally. That was quite a long elevator pitch, my goodness.
No, but it's actually quite cool. You mentioned that there are different types of altruism. Is there a name for the type of altruism that you're talking about when it's shared or commons altruism, as opposed to, say, lying down and taking a bullet for someone else?
That's a really interesting question. Let me think for a second. But my hunch is that there isn't really, and that the word altruism ought to encompass these things. But in a lot of measures in psychology for measuring altruism, these kind of behaviors aren't included in the way they measure it. So that's something I'd like to change. It would be nice to not have to invent a new word and be able to have the word extend to collective forms of altruism. We can call it collective altruism, but it's a
collective altruism. Great. Okay, let's call it that. So you've done previous work where you had a paper focusing on kidney donors.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you talked to people who had decided to remain anonymous as kidney donors and asked them what they thought about the process and how they justified their own worldview. Can you talk a bit about that work?
Yeah, of course. So this was my first bit of work in altruism, and I spoke to people who had given a kidney to a stranger, and this is through the NHS, so the National Health Service in the UK. They have a transplant scheme where you can give a kidney to a stranger, and the way that it works is unless the person you've given a kidney to comes forward and chooses to make contact with you, then you'll never know the person you gave it to. You won't know if the transplant took. You won't know if they're grateful for receiving it. So it's often hailed in psychological research as like the prototypical, maybe individualist altruist action, because it's giving away a part of your body that affects your health to someone you might never even meet. And a lot of the discourse around this was, especially by the medical staff and renal teams, sometimes they would think this is kind of a mad thing to want to do, to put yourself at that level of risk for a stranger, especially as surgeons who have to do the operation and are very aware of the risks that go with it. So there was kind of this, almost a dichotomy between, are these people incredibly altruistic, the purest form of altruism, or are they mad, or are they heroic? And I wanted to explore what this altruism meant to kidney donors in their own words, and how they negotiated how society saw this incredibly altruistic act. And the thing that surprised me was, I think, listening to, so I got their life stories and tried to talk about what might have led up to this moment of deciding to donate. And it was surprisingly mundane. It would be things like, I was driving along in my car, listening to the radio, and I heard this was possible. And when I heard it was possible, I just thought, well, why not? People would just say, why not? Like, as soon as they found out this altruistic action was possible, they couldn't think about how not to do it. And they didn't see themselves as exceptional or mad, for that matter. So there's something about negotiating the difference between what motivates people to do something for others, which is often mundane and coming from a place of care and things that we think of as so everyday, we kind of overlook them, versus society characterizing it as something extreme, heroic, brave, mad. That was sort of the gist of it.
I'm remembering the early days of working on Node, and there was a group of people who called themselves mad scientists and the mad scientist coders. And I'm wondering, have you looked at the motivations of open source developers, and are they the same?
There's a little bit of academic research on this, and I've come to speak to quite a few people working on open source now over the course of my research. And I think there are some things that overlap, but the thing that stands out to me as a motive in people in open source is, I mean, two things. First, it seems like there's an incredible amount of intellectual curiosity and taking satisfaction in working out something that's challenging just for the sake of doing it. And I think for a lot of people, being able to start hacking, getting involved in programming was only possible because all of the knowledge that you need to learn how to do it is out there in the open. And I think there's something about, if you are motivated by intellectual curiosity, this kind of goes hand in hand with this belief that knowledge should be something that should be shared. It shouldn't be put behind a paywall. It shouldn't be restricted. So there's kind of overlap between point one, intellectual curiosity, and point two, which is a belief in the value of sharing knowledge. And that's something I really respect about open source, that frankly, this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but I think in academia in general, we've accepted this system of publication where we do research, we often pay to get it put in a journal, open access, or, you know, we peer review each other's work for free. It gets put behind a paywall, the publisher rakes in loads of money from it. You're restricting access to your own research. We've accepted that as a system. And I think if we had more of a motivation, like people in open source do, to share knowledge openly, that would be beneficial in academia more broadly. So it's kind of inspiring as well.
So we talked about the motivations and how developers begin. And yes, it would be nice if academia was more motivated by giving back to the commons instead of motivated by getting tenure or whatever it is that you need. But one of the issues with being in open source is that motivations change over time depending upon external input. At the beginning, you're like, I'm going to make this cool thing. I put it out online. Maybe people will come. And by the end, you're like, someone is yelling at me and I have to deal with this. And now I'm motivated to make the pain go away by responding to their issue and closing it as soon as I can. That process often leads to maintainer burnout, which is what you talk about in your recent report, which was funded by Sentry and involved over 50 interviews with various maintainers. Is that correct?
Oh, so reading 50 different articles, blog posts, videos, that sort of thing. And then I did follow-up interviews with about 8 maintainers.
Thanks for sharing about the motivations of kidney transplant donors. I was really struck by some of the words you said remind me of open source people. And motivations are interesting. And yes, I wish academics spent a lot more time actually just contributing back and thinking about that as being the main product of their research instead of, say, getting tenure. One of the things that you write about in your really large report on maintainer burnout is how people are later, motivations change because you end up trying to make the pain go away of someone yelling at you on GitHub about my bug being there. And that can be very, very exhausting. So I want to ask about motivations, but first, maybe, can you describe how this report came into being and what you did in it?
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to tell this story chronologically. So I came to find out through a connection that Century, who they run this really great project to try and raise money for open source maintainers, the Open Source Pledge. If your company relies on open source software, you can join the pledge if you promise to pay more than $2,000 per developer at your company per year. And they wanted to write a post for their blog about burnout in open source and wanted a psychologist to do some research behind it. And I thought, because this intersects with my interests in altruism, my interests in complex societal problems, I thought I'd love to research this more. I know a little bit about open source software, but I'm quite worried about saying something that'll really out me as a noob on this podcast. So
you're fine.
Oh, good. So that's how I got involved. And initially it was just to inform a blog post, but I got so into reading about it that to inform this blog post, wrote a 47-page report on everything I've found. I do get a little bit obsessive. And in the end, we decided to publish that and publicize that too. So I wanted to understand what it was like to be an open source maintainer and what the experience of burnout was like. And I realized when I was doing a bit of background research that we have some quantitative reports on burnout and open source. We've got the Tidelift State of the Maintainer report, but there isn't much qualitative work. And I thought, I only have a short amount of time to get this work done in. I don't have time to speak to a huge number of maintainers, but there's an awful lot that people share online of their experiences. So I went and looked for blog posts, I looked for videos, podcasts, discussions of burnout in open source from people working in open source and people working around it to try and identify the themes, the things that kept coming up over and over again, and try and get to the bottom of some of the things that might be causing burnout in open source specifically. And also to kind of think about what it is we might do about it, thinking about this as a systemic issue rather than an issue of individual psychology. And so there is a lot of really good advice online about how to cope with burnout as an open source maintainer, but a lot of the advice focuses on individual level fixes. So things like developing thick skin to deal with toxicity in the community, or learning to say no to things that feel unreasonable, or to match the amount of energy that you give to maintaining to the amount of energy that, for example, people put in their pull requests. And this is all really helpful, but there are some things about open source in general that make burnout more likely that you as an individual can't change. So I also wanted to try and focus on working out what we can do to change things at a system level that isn't leaving the onus on individual developers to work out what I can do to cope with burnout when the problem is much, much larger than them.
What did you find that we could do as a community to make things better from a systemic level?
There are so many things that we could do. These are quite broad, and I realize the way that you implement them is going to be quite difficult to work out.
Yep.
But broad strokes, the thing that really stood out to me the most is that, and I realized talking about money is something of a taboo in open source, or at the very least, it's like an elephant in the room. We've acknowledged that the elephant's in the room, so everyone knows it's there, but we don't really know what to do about it. So we just kind of laugh about it nervously, but the elephant is still here. I think we need to make it easier for developers to get paid. And something came up at FOSDEM, which I was just at a few weeks ago, where there'd be discussion about, is open source sustainability about people or is it about money? And I think this is maybe a false dichotomy, because if we are, as a collective, as a group that benefits from the existence of open source, leaving developers to struggle to make a living, to struggle to cope financially, to make huge personal sacrifices in order to contribute to the commons, just because they chose to contribute to the commons, then that's not respecting the people of open source. So money and respecting the people of open source are intertwined. And I think this is really important for burnout, because some of the things that came up time and time again was, maintenance work, it takes a lot of time anyway. And if you're not paid to do it, then developers have to have a job alongside, sometimes doing a full-time job, then doing work on the open source. So doing this kind of double shift, and sometimes not even realizing it, because like you said earlier, open source, it starts out as a hobby. It starts out as something you do for the joy of it, for the passion of it. That's your initial motivation. And then once it becomes larger and there's more and more work, it's like your hobby has slid from something you do for fun that energizes you, which would help protect against burnout, to something that drains you, drains your energy away. And you don't even realize that that's draining you because you're not registering it as work. So I think there's something about recognizing maintenance work is work. A labor of love is still labor. And this is contributing to the common good, not just to people who also work in open source, but so much of the world now depends on open source software. We've got companies making a huge amount of money off open source software. We need to give back so people aren't making individual sacrifices in order to do labor of love, contribute to the commons, do maintenance. And it's just difficult. We live in a market society that sort of values extraction, or where the typical way of making money is if you have something valuable, you restrict access to it, and then you get people to pay you to give access to it. So trying to stand against that, do maintenance work, do care work, contribute to the commons while living in a market society is really challenging. And I think this is probably the biggest and the gnarliest contributor to burnout, the hardest to solve. There are probably ways that if we did implement funding for open source that might make burnout worse. So how it's done really matters. But I think this is the number one problem to solve.
Hold on a sec there. There's a lot in that.
Yeah.
First, I want to start by saying that the image of a solo developer giving all of their time to open source and maintaining it on their own and then having a large project and having people contribute to it is only one of many different archetypes in open source for maintainers. A lot of open source maintainers are actually doing it as part of their job and may have been paid from the get-go to work on open source or to work on inner source and then open it, or to be a paid staff member working, say, on a dependency that's important. The examples would be something like Google paying someone to work on browser implementations. Do you think that burnout also happens in those situations where it actually is their job to work on it? And did you talk to anyone or did you read anything that shows that there's different types of burnout depending upon whether or not the person comes from that background?
I've spoken to some maintainers who really favor this model where you have a job which also allots a little bit of time for you to work on open source, because then you're still getting paid for your open source work. It's getting factored into the hours that you do, so you're not doing this double shift. But I do think there's still a risk of burnout in getting paid for open source, because psychological research going back to like 1970s, I think it was by a man called Karasek, I forget his first name, shows that the more we have autonomy over our work, so the more we have freedom and control over how we work, the more protective this is against burnout. And if you're getting paid to do open source work, but as a corollary of that, you have less control over what you're working on and how you're working on it, when you're working on it, or the direction of the project, then you have all the responsibility that goes with maintaining open source, but also you don't have control over how to implement it. And having a high degree of responsibility, a high pressure at work, and not enough control over how you do it is a real risk factor of burnout. So while this model has its benefits, again, how it's implemented in practice really matters in terms of reducing maintainer burnout. I think it's promising and it seems to benefit a lot of people, but freedom and control over how you work is really important.
One of the standing jokes for this podcast is that all problems just end up being capitalism, right? So it's really hard because work is extractive and money is really difficult. And at some point you do need to live in the market economy that we live in. So what's interesting about open source is that people are contributing their free time or resources towards something which is in the global commons that anyone can basically say, hey, what's going on with this? And so you end up with a lot more demand than you may be able to gate based upon where you're sitting as a maintainer or an admin or a PDFL. You mentioned earlier that there are things that systemically we can do. And so we just sort of mentioned pay. And I think we sort of touched on the idea of giving more responsibility or less responsibility, or allowing the conditions for mastery and joy to happen as opposed to the conditions for burnout and pain. What else can we do?
So before I go back to that, going back to what you said about it being a running joke on this podcast that everything comes back to, oh no, we live under capitalism. I wanted in my report to be able to point to some things we can do about burnout that we can actually change, because a lot of systemic things are very hard to change and they take that kind of collaborative action in order to change. That can be very hard to implement and involves a lot of people working together. But I think there are things we can do that work with the system we have that can also contribute to maintainers getting paid. So in fact, this goes a bit back to something you were saying right at the beginning of the podcast about how when people start out in open source, it starts out as a hobby. You're sharing code with other developers. It's developers sharing code with developers. And in this kind of situation, well, in psychology, we understand that group behavior that's naturally organized coalesces around group norms. So group norms are sort of like unspoken rules for how the group is supposed to behave. And when you're a developer sharing code with other developers, there are these unspoken rules that, yes, you're giving away your code for free, but also you're expecting that other people will contribute to it and that you'll all share in the value of that code if it turns out to be useful in some way. And I think we're in a situation now where people who are a bit further from that inner group of developers working with other developers are starting to realize the value of open source. So people who are further from this in-group who follow the group norms are now using open source software, relying on it, making money out of it, creating things that have become critical parts of our infrastructure. And they're not abiding by those group norms of giving back, contributing, whether it's money, whether it's also hiring people who then work on open source maintenance. And there's one way within market society that doesn't involve trying to dismantle the system of capitalism to encourage these people who benefit from open source to give back and to contribute to those group norms. And so one of the things that we can do is try and make the people who benefit from open source feel like part of this in-group and feel bound to abide by those group norms of giving back. So this is something the Open Source Pledge is good for, because it is getting people to commit to being part of the open source community, make a public commitment to follow those norms. And when you make a commitment public, you're more likely to follow up on it. But also it makes you feel part of the group of people who contribute to and benefit from open source. So you're more likely to subscribe to those group norms, even if you are a proprietary software company that's making money off open source. So I think the more we make sure that people who rely on open source, whether it's companies, whether it's governments, whether it's users who don't even know that they're relying on packages made for free by someone in their spare time, to feel part of this wider open source community, the more there will be pressure to correspond to these norms of giving something back and of actually governing the commons rather than just extracting from it. So I think there is still hope from a perspective of social psychology, but it's going to take a lot of work and not the kind of work that an individual can do on their own.
The open source pledge is a great idea where companies can say, I'm going to give $2,000 or per developer or whatever to open source. And it's a good idea because it sends money towards open source maintainers. Money is a proxy for value. And what's interesting about open source maintainers is that they're in this space where they have these collective norms. Hey, we work together. Hey, we work in public. Hey, we try to be kind or else GTFO. Companies don't have values. Companies have people who have values, but they don't inherently by themselves have personhood, regardless of what American law says.
Yeah.
And we're also seeing other movements that are sort of similar to the company movement, like the CRA, right? The Cyber Resiliency Act is an idea where anyone who produces a product that involves open source software is liable for it. And they have this concept of stewards for people who maintain it. And so we're going to end up with open source projects that have downstream users having to allocate someone to deal with policy initiatives, which is very different from, open an issue and we got this. And I'm wondering whether the desire to have companies sign off and voluntarily pledge is one approach, and the desire to have policy to put things down is another approach. But both of those might be fundamentally at odds with the idea of just contributing to the commons because you want to contribute. And so I'm curious from a psychologist's perspective, how do we understand whether those work and whether we should try something else?
It's difficult because, going back to some of the things I said earlier about motivation, I think if you have rules that are too rigid such that they change how open source developers go about their work, so they have to change the direction of a project in order to conform to some policy requirement, that could put people at a greater risk of burnout because they're losing that autonomy over their work. And if that is also coupled with them having to take a lot of responsibility for the consequences of not doing this, then that would be a great risk of burnout. And obviously when maintainers burn out and there's no one to look after the project, then that creates its own security risks and sustainability risks and is an ethical issue because of the harm to those maintainers. But at the same time, I do think that once a group gets sufficiently large, having unspoken, unwritten rules, these group norms that we all know to follow, but they're not formalized in some way, might not be enough. So I'm glad I'm not a policymaker, because I think trying to figure out how to implement a policy that preserves open source maintainer autonomy, also formalizes some of these group norms about giving back, doesn't make burnout worse, doesn't restrict how we work. It's a very difficult thing to get right. So as a psychologist, I think there are a lot of things we need to figure out and important things to bear in mind if you're someone who's working on this. I hope that answers your question somewhat.
It's important. I mean, as an academic, we sometimes ask more questions than we answer.
I'm very good at asking, prescribing something absolute. Well, we always want to keep a degree of uncertainty about our conclusions in science.
So you co-run a research group here at the University of Edinburgh.
That's right.
The Ideology Research Group with Vlad Stefan Harbutz. Vlad Stefan, I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. In this talk, we've been talking about burnout and assuming that burnout is the worst thing possible and we all need to avoid burnout. But any healthy ecosystem has leaves which fall down to the forest floor and creates wonderful loam and detritus for other things to grow.
What a cute metaphor.
Well, I hope it's a good one because when we have open source projects that die, it leaves the possibility of forking them or at least seeds which can be regenerated. What happens after burnout? Is it a healthy part of the ecosystem? Can you regrow after burnout? Do you switch to a different thing?
I think there are two things I can say in response to that, possibly three. For one thing, I think it's important if we can do something about burnout before it reaches the point where someone decides to quit open source completely, if that's not something they originally wanted to do, if something about the conditions in open source have led you to quit when otherwise you wouldn't have wanted to. I think we should be sad about that fallen leaf and that particular part of detritus. Gosh, it doesn't feel nice to call people who drop out detritus. But also, one of the maintainers that I spoke to said something that I thought was quite impactful about how you can learn a lot about a community from the things that they don't talk about. And one of the things that he thought wasn't talked about so much in open source is how to wind down a project, or I've heard it called sunsetting a project, which it's funny, it seems to have the same taboo around talking about winding up a project as we have around talking about death or end of life care. And I think there's a lot of talk about your project becoming popular, making it, I mean, maybe outside of open source, more in tech in general, about going to the moon. But I think having a plan for how to wind down your project so that then it can be taken over in an elegant way so the collective knowledge that you've built isn't lost is really important, and it's something we should be talking about. But more than that, having a plan for what to do if you get overwhelmed or you can't maintain this project anymore, you've lost love for it, you just can't look at it anymore, so that it doesn't get completely neglected. It's probably in a way protective against burnout and stops you reaching that point where you become a fallen leaf feeding the ecosystem, because you know that if you're stretched too thin, that you can actually have a plan for what to do to step back. There are people who you've perhaps mentored who might be able to take over it, or you know how to hand it down to someone else or wind it up. So I think if we could get past this taboo of not talking about sunsetting projects, that would be good for burnout, but also enable projects to be wound down in a way that's elegant and can lead on to something that does feed the ecosystem rather than, it's a bit like, God, I'm going to do a weird metaphor now. The difference between having a natural burial where you're buried under a tree, your nutrients feed the tree, it grows into something new and beautiful, or being, cremated or buried in a grave where you're not going back to the ecosystem. You want to, this is getting a little bit strange. You want to feed the ecosystem when you go.
I actually like that metaphor. It's interesting because there's two products of open source. There's the maintainer's individual growth as a person and what they're doing and where they go next. And then there's the open source project, which, because it's open source, is normally permanently available. Very few people take down open source and turn it closed source by just removing it, right? Which would violate one of the open source principles anyway of distribution. Changing tech very slightly. Did any of the kidney donors you talked to regret it? And the reason I ask is because open source maintainers that burn out often say, I wish I hadn't done open source. That was really tough. That was a hard part of my life. It was really annoying. I really didn't like those people. I'd rather just do closed source. I'd rather be proprietary. Or now I run a brewery and I'm just much happier. And I'm wondering if there's another way that we could frame it, or we can understand the psychology of burnout in open source, where kind of like an elegant life cycle. I like your use of the word elegant earlier. we could see burnout as actually a natural part of the process of giving to open source and not something to be ashamed of or afraid of?
I mean, in response to your question about kidney donors, of the people that I spoke to, I think even though there's acknowledgement of the difficulty of the process generally, and more so with time, it felt like something like a gift that kept on giving. So you know you've done this good thing, and where your kidney once was, there's this smile inside and this warmth. We'd want maintainers to be able to leave, or even if they had a difficult time and had to recover from a really difficult period, they could look back on it and realize there was something that they also got out of being involved, instead of it being a scar, being something that actually has a significant part of their life and an important part of their values. And I think if that's not happening, if people are bowing out and they just can never think about it again, want to go to closed source or never touch a computer again, or I think something's going wrong when you drop out. It feels like a personal failure. And in fact, linking back to something I talk about more in my report, and going back to that idea that there can be a danger of only prescribing individual fixes for burnout. If you only prescribe individual fixes for burnout, then when maintainers do burn out, it feels like it's a personal failure. Like, I think this came up recently with, have you been following what happened at Tailwind CSS with Adam Wathan? I was listening to his podcast, Adam's Morning Walk, and he describes how so just to try and do a TLDR of the situation, revenues at Tailwind were down. He had to lay off 70% of his staff, and users wanted this feature implemented where it makes it easier for LLMs to read the documentation. But the documentation is part of how Tailwind connects with customers who might buy freemium features. So Adam didn't want to implement this at this point in time, because that would mean that revenues are at greater risk of going down, and the whole system was already bleeding out. And deciding not to do this then made some people in the community angry, because it's sort of going against open source values in their eyes, or people saying, oh, you're just in it for the money. And this culminates in Adam saying that he feels personally like he's failed, or like he feels like a effing moron for not being able to figure out how to monetize this otherwise incredibly popular piece of software. And I thought that to me really encapsulates the problem of, if there's only individual level fixes, you as an individual maintainer are responsible for making your project make enough money in order to survive, rather than this being a responsibility that is shared with all the people who benefit from it. Then if you do burn out, you feel like a failure. And one of the things about burnout, the ways it affects us, is that it can affect our sense of self-worth. It can make us feel like we're lousy at what we do. It makes you feel guilty. And if you're already feeling that way when you're burnt out, and it feels like you failed to implement the individual fixes that could have stopped it, I think that can lead to a really unhealthy sort of burnout, of the type you describe, where you just disappear, can't think about it ever again. Open source is like a stain on your past rather than something that you can look back on fondly. So
I'm wondering, for me, I had many conversations on this topic before. It always seems fairly simple. Give back to maintainers. If they want financial stuff, help them get funding, give them funding. If you can't do that, say thank you a lot, be very kind, be generous, send notes to the maintainer saying, I used your work and it was amazing. Send photos of the kids whose lives were saved, et cetera, right? Help develop a sense of autonomy and power and use. Help them feel mastery. But that's all very easy to say. There are other situations in human life where there are things that are easy to say don't work very well, and we have roles for those. One of them would actually be death. So we have death doulas, or we have hospice workers who help figure out how to maneuver people through these times by holding in space for them and doing forms of emotional care. When you say we should look beyond individual actions for maintainers to stop burnout, but think about systemic community actions, do you have any suggestions for community roles that could be filled or created to allow that sort of work to happen more easily?
Yeah, so something that, again, this came up a lot at FOSDEM, so I feel like it's an issue that people are recognizing. There's a big role to be played by mentorship. I mean, this helps burnout in a lot of ways, in that if we have strong mentorship, then You're more likely to get collaborators who feel confident contributing to your project and are going to stay there over time. And then obviously the more people you have maintaining your project, the easier it is to step back if you're overwhelmed. So it's easier to take a break before you burn out because there's people you can trust to pass on the work to in your absence. But also there's something that I think is important to bear in mind, that I got this from a conversation I had with a maintainer as part of my research. It's also putting a lot of pressure on mentors to do this kind of work. It's energy to nurture someone into feeling confident contributing to your project. And as I mentioned, burnout is a disorder where, you give more energy than you get back from the work that you do. And I think there was an interesting talk by Abby Kabanock-Mays at FOSDEM about how it's important to be able to pick who you mentor. So give your energy to someone who you know is going to give back in kind. They keep coming back. She has 3 C's or something, and I can't remember what they are. Consistency and the other 2. So I think if there's a way of helping people identify who will benefit from that kind of nurture, who's going to keep coming back if you nurture them, and then trying to build these kind of mentoring relationships to bring more people in would really benefit.
Abby's talk was great. It was recorded, so you can look it up. The 3 C's she had were comprehension, context, and continuity. Consistency, continuity. It's close. It's pretty close. Comprehension, do they understand the problem well enough to propose a change? Context, do they give me what I need to review this well? And do they keep coming back? These are the signals for finding contributors worth mentoring. Thank you, Abigail. I had another thought off the back of that as well. This maintainer I spoke to talked to me about this concept of a mentorship triangle. And this is something I know about from therapy. So when you get therapy, it's very common that your therapist also has a therapist who's their mentor. And in order to cope with the things that they hear on a daily basis, they in turn have someone that they can go to for support if they're personally affected or if they feel out of their depth. And I think there's a role for this in open source too, an idea that if you're mentoring someone to take the reins on your project, you also as a mentor should have some support yourself, so you're not alone with the responsibility of bringing in new contributors. You feel like you can get help if you're burnt out. So this idea of having, a triangle, 3 pillars supporting each other, I think that might be helpful for reducing the pressure on senior members to mentor people into open source, when it can also be a drain on their energy too. I like that it's a triangle or more of a circular pattern of mentorship, and it's not just watching the watchmakers, et cetera, where it's just you have to find someone else, then someone at the end is stuck with the entire chain of responsibility. This has been really great. We are running up on time. So your report is online. You can find it. I think your website was Miranda Heath. MirandaHeath.website. And we'll have these links as well as socials in the show notes, which you can find on podcast.sustainoss.org. Do you have any other final thoughts or comments on your open source burnout work or other work? Yeah, so there was something else that after I gave my talk at FOSDEM came up quite a lot with people I was talking to that I think actually is a little bit of a gap in my report on, didn't come up in my initial research, where people were talking about how in the open source community, a lot of people are neurodiverse, a lot of people have autism or ADHD, and I'm shocked by this news. I can say this as someone with autism myself. When you're autistic, burnout, it hits different. There are more things beyond the normal world of work that burn you out. So doing something incredibly social can be extraordinarily draining. Just coping with lots of sources of sensory input in your environment. And when autistic people burn out, the effects can be incredibly strong. You can lose the ability to think clearly, to be able to speak at all. You can become shut down or regress. And I think this hasn't come up much in discussions of burnout that I read about. And I think there's probably more research we could do and more we can do as a community to accommodate people who are autistic or accommodate people with ADHD for whom planning and organizing and dealing with loads of emails and pull requests is even more draining and challenging. And I'd love to do some more research on that. I'd love there to be more of a conversation around that. It's something I feel personally passionate about, also because my brothers both have autism and also
really interested in programming. My older brother was, and he's the reason I know about Linux and open source and anything about internet and how that works. And he would have been more able to contribute if there had been more of a conversation about how to include people whose brains just work in a slightly different way. So that's something that I think we need to look into more as a community.
I really love that. I haven't had autistic burnout talked about on this podcast before, so thank you so much for bringing that up.
You're welcome.
Which actually leads us pretty much into the Spotlight section, which I feel like you already just did with your brother, but that's okay. You can do another one. Mm-hmm. Spotlight's the part of the show where we highlight other people, projects, or things that we like and we think just need a bit more light shed on them. Traditionally, the host goes first. My Spotlight today is going to be a bit more local. Mm-hmm. I stayed with my friend Hamish Callan while I was here in Edinburgh. He's a lecturer at geography at the University of Edinburgh. Good for you, Hamish. Hamish is a member of a fantastic klezmer band.
Oh, wow.
Called Och Vey. That's OCHVEY. You can find them on Instagram, and you can find them in your nearest pub every now and then, and also at pretty awesome anarchist gatherings and the like. So if you're into klezmer music and having a very good time, I would suggest looking up Och Vey. Excellent Scottish klezmer folk. And that's a weird shout out, but it's good to have different stuff every now and then.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I'm going to look them up right away. Yeah. Oh, gosh, that's my Spotlight. You know what I've been enjoying recently? A game that's just come out called, I hope I get the number right, TR49. It's a puzzle game. It's one of those games where you're on your computer, but simulating another computer and trying to find all these links between books in an archive to solve some as yet unclear mystery set in the basement of a computing lab in Manchester. And the vibes are great. And if you need to completely disappear into another world, maybe you're burnt out and you need a little bit of escapism, I couldn't recommend that more highly. In fact, after this, when I'm socially drained, I'm going to go back to my fake computer and my real computer, dig through some fake archives. So that's my Spotlight.
That's a great Spotlight. Thank you so much for sharing that. I may have to go and do that as well. But for now, I'm just going to say thank you so much for coming on. MirandaHeath.website. Podcast at sustainoss.org is where all the show notes are, and you can find those and follow up and look at the awesome work that Miranda has done. Listeners, if you enjoy this podcast, there's also things that you can do as part of the large open source community to help other people out. That's right. That's right. Funding is one of the main things you can do for the Sustain Open Source podcast. We are looking for a second funder to donate around $10,000 for the next year of podcasts. If you have an idea who that would be, email me immediately, post haste pronto, at richard@sustainoss.org. You can also go to richard@sustainoss.org if you have complaints or comments or thanks or glorifications, whatever you really want. The other thing you can do is you can share this podcast wherever podcasts are bought and sold. So if you listen to it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, Screw Ice, or any other place like that, feel free to just share that link with a friend who might enjoy this, maybe an autistic friend who could learn about how they could be helped. That would be great. You can follow us on Mastodon and LinkedIn and Bluesky. You can join our discourse at discourse.sustainoss.org, and you can find more episodes and show notes, again, the last time, podcast.sustainoss.org, and you can donate yourself if you're so inclined at Open Collective at SustainOSS. Miranda, this was really, really great. Thank you so much. Best of luck on the PhD.
Thank you. I might need it.
Yeah, me too. Good luck. Remember, it's giving back to the global commons, and that in itself is a gift.
If I don't publish and just put it on my website, I'm actually doing everyone a favor. Who needs peer review?
Who needs peer review? Excellent question. Thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you.